Okay, so this paper will demonstrate the applicability of affect theory and what Brian Masumi called the politics of affect to what is, I argue, an evocative conceptual document of the administration of George W. Bush, 2001 through 2009. Along with the influence of neoconservative politics in those years, existing studies on popular music of the era have identified the album as significant in the sense that it reflects and responds historically to the totalitarian potential of the Republican agenda. Promo materials for the release encouraged fans to use the tagline "Art as Resistance" as a signal of the emancipatory potential the concept held. The historical relevance of the album, then, is well established, but little attention is paid to the way in which the political climate of the era impacted upon Reznor's songcraft. Beyond apparent thematic similarity, affect theory's focus is non-linguistic forces, and the manner in which they act upon us individually and communally in our daily lives, in the stories we tell ourselves about normalities across various artistic media. This manner of interpreting cultural production is significant with respect to Reznor's dystopian 2007 concept album Year Zero, because its maturation as a subject was largely articulated through the dominant rhetoric of fear, anxiety, and threat, naturalized under the Bush administration. In his seminal article on the topic, Brian Masumi uses the following quote from Bush's re-election gambit in 2004. The question he could not escape from was the increasingly dubious facticity of Saddam Hussein's role in the supply of arms or knowledge to Al-Qaeda or similar terrorist factions. Although we have not found stockpiles of weapons, I believe we were right to go into Iraq. America is safer today because we did. We removed a declared enemy of America, who had the capacity of producing weapons of mass destruction and could have passed that capability to terrorists bent on acquiring them. Masumi explains the logic as follows. The invasion was right because in the past there was a future threat. You cannot erase a fact like that. Just because the menace potential never became clear and a clear and present danger doesn't mean that it wasn't there, all the more real for being non-existent. The threat will have been real because it was felt to be real, whether the danger was existent or not. The menace was felt in the form of fear. What is not actually real can be felt into being. Threat does not have an actual mode of existence. Or rather, threat does have an actual mode of existence, and has an impending reality in the present. This actual reality is affective. For Masumi, an emotion like fear or threat forms a real experience, whether or not it is grounded in fact. And its demonstrable affect is not only important, but it can form part of a political strategy through everyday lived experience for those who are subject to it. Threat was deliberately heightened by virtue of neoconservative policy. Though Bush wasn't actually a diehard neoconservative, the demographic, geographical, and value-oriented makeup of the Republican Party meant that its predilections for romantic domestication, a strong offensive militaristic stance, and the moral superiority of the West bolstered by the Judeo-Christian moral tradition formed a key part of the justification for aggressive foreign policy. Its effectiveness relied upon the reality of felt threat, which naturally exacerbates perceived collective national trauma and a strike-first mentality that informed a new perceived clash of civilizations. This new and renewed focus on physicality is actually discernible in the way Trent Reznor was portrayed, or portrayed himself during these years. Reznor, who achieved iconic status around the time introspective grunge imploded, and the gothic bravado of shock rock re-emerged shortly afterwards in the 1990s, used to look like this. Pale, anemic, wiry, sullen, and suitably moody. Following interventionist treatment and drastic alterations of lifestyle to address the addictions that plagued him throughout the 90s, he re-emerged in 2005 looking like this. Themes of masochism and asceticism no longer saturated his audio and visual aesthetic, but rather a reactionary and physically threatening physique now dominated. The thematic centre of his creative output shifted following treatment and a return to sobriety. One commentator even remarked on his new, quote, superhuman physique. This sits comfortably with the genres he has always played with, which are often defined by white working class masculinity, a trope the Year Zero project consciously embraces and subverts by highlighting its utilitarian status in a time of perpetual conflict. Its values were those which appeared most at risk. The album and accompanying media exhibits an alteration of style which I argue to be synonymous with the externalisation of threat, while the broader mediascape of its content dissemination distorts the sincerity of its lyricism. The muscular tropes of industrial rock find new applicability as crucial facets of the artist-to-fan interface, then in a state of drastic alteration post-Napster, as this period of trauma in the music industry meant the equally as frantic political landscape. By applying Masumi's ideas regarding affect to the Year Zero project and its self-conscious stimulation of threat in its corporeal manifestations through performance, it is possible to map the affect of these lived ideologies onto musical production, dissemination, and performance. Following Masumi, David Holloway suggests that the years defined by the so-called War on Terror are largely definable by imperceptibilities. The neoconservative narrative about 9/11 and the War on Terror is itself an account that is grounded in affect. Or at least it is a version of historical events that positions 9/11 on the very edge of semantic and cognitive availability. In his address to Congress on September 20, 2001, the speech in which he declares war on terror and formally establishes the hegemonic account of the attacks, President Bush presents 9/11 as an inexplicable, motiveless, irrational, surprise attack, a moment of apocalyptic violence that cannot be processed cognitively because the attacks have no clear intellectual cause or rationale, and certainly no political agenda beyond what the president describes as blind hatred of the American way. The neoconservative narrative is governed instead by a politics of affect, a calculated appeal to feeling, to the gut, to those sensations driving horror, anger, fear, or loathing, followed then by a structuring or steering of these affects into doctrinal narratives about transcendent national mission and redemptive military violence in a moment of profound historical rupture. Holloway's methodology is primarily concerned with the Pulitzer Prize-winning 2006 novel The Road by Cormac McCarthy. It shares the now overused dystopian tropes Resner's Year Zero project used as its conceptual premise. The Road tells of a father and son left alone wandering the highways of the United States after some unnamed event took place. Law and order have vanished, with the only remaining moral categories relating to whether or not you eat people to survive. Thus, some intangible event has rendered the average American inhabitant animalistic and violent. Or worse, displaced by some unknown other. Both the novel and film are exceedingly grim, inspiring revulsion, sentimentality, and resilience in its audience, in response to a traumatic and insurmountable loss of societal structures, which they are predisposed, considering its surroundings, to associate with the notion of America under threat. Therefore, threat and anxiety evoked by the novel are deeply political on both the horizons of author and audience. Holloway argues that the horizon of the consumer's interpretation and consumption is inevitably affected by the structure of feeling generated by socio-political features. Authorial intention may respond to this and actively seek to critique it, and I argue this to be a discernible intention of Year Zero. Its conceptualization, modes of delivery, and methods of consumption comment upon the paradigms crucial to generating and sustaining the psychological reality of threat. Rather than producing music and media that is aggressive in order to be categorized under rock or industrial metal, the assumed characteristics of these genres become arenas of reflexive creative practice. Expectations of passive and perhaps senseless rage denote a change of voicing in Resner's lyricism. Violence against itself is no longer the locus of potential threat. Rather, this now comes from an unknown source of indeterminate identity. The concept of Year Zero was slowly introduced to fans through a variety of promotional avenues in fragmented fashion prior to knowledge that the project would ultimately manifest in the release of an album. digitally rendered imagery of a dystopian landscape emerged online with little context. This was followed by a brief promotional tour of intimate venues, at which USB keys were hidden in toilet cubicles containing song samples. T-shirts and band merchandise were also sold and found to contain URL links that linked the physical media to online web pages displaying propaganda for various entities related to the US Bureau of Morality, a fictional administrative entity of the Year Zero dystopia. When the physical CD of the album was released, a sticker bearing the logo for this domestic morality agency also contained a phone number. When fans inevitably called it, the following automated message could be heard. Citizen, by calling this number, you and your family have implicitly pleaded guilty to the consumption of anti-American media. By acknowledging this message and interacting with other cryptic media disseminated through online and physical portals, encouraging autonomous fan groups to organize into so-called resistance factions as the hype around the release was sustained by the gamified campaign, some interlocutors were contacted to attend a quote resistance meeting, assuming it to be an enigmatic and thematized fan club gathering. Participants willfully endured crowd control evocative of totalitarian governance, before bearing witness to Nine Inch Nails perform songs from the album in an intimate setting. This performance was promptly and performatively interrupted by a SWAT team representing the Bureau of Morality. Reznor did not merely create a dystopian concept album, but rather instigated an accompanying piece of performance art. Its marketing and participation are framed by and within the parameters denoted by the affective politics of threat. Year Zero is an expansive exercise of immersion within and exposure to affect-based politics. Arguably the most identifiable characteristic of Reznor's aesthetic up until Year Zero was the confessional tone of his lyrical output. Whereas the sounds of early heavy metal and hard rock may have channeled the hardships, class struggles and social injustices of bands like Black Sabbath, Reznor's version was far from welcoming righteous anger or bravado, but rather a seething rage at his isolation from every sphere of class solidarity. The problem his lyricism suggested always lay with him. Perhaps his most identifiable lyric of those early years is the first line of the closing song from his 1994 magnum opus, Hurt, a song Johnny Cash would cover in 2003 to express the sorrowful disconnectedness of old age. It reads, I hurt myself today to see if I still feel. I focus on the pain, the only thing that's real. The simple point being underscored here is Reznor's early self-deprecating, confessional and nihilistic songwriting style. His project slowed in the early years of the 2000s. Upon conceptualizing Year Zero toward the end of the Bush presidency, he uttered the following. When it came to write the words, I really wanted to focus on something that was at the forefront of my consciousness, which is, as an American, I'm appalled by the behavior of our government, the direction that it has taken for the first time in my life. I wanted to break away from the idea of opening up my journal and transferring that into song lyrics. These sentiments, of course, are not exceptional. Musical artists from David Bowie to Coldplay, Bruce Springsteen and even Sheryl Crow proudly and performatively defied the Patriots Act, openly decrying the militaristic actions of the era. Protest can be cheap, vapid and self-immolating depending on the context. What I'm proposing here is observing the manner in which the conventions of confessional lyricism were changed via the affective politics prescribed by Holloway and Masumi, or rather described by Holloway and Masumi. The way in which America was made to feel about the new atmosphere of threat amended the identity of the speaker in Reznor's imagined sonic dystopia. Threat is no longer perceived as being of and from oneself, internal or domestic, but rather the domestic is sacralized and immunized against some external menace of vague dimension. The transposition of threat from the domestic to the unknown outsider reflects the homeland policies of the Bush administration, and what is more, Reznor's lyrics are no longer autobiographical in their tonality, but the songs are narrated in objective style. The voicing iterates neoconservative ideology and normalizes its effects on the speaker as some moment of ill-defined reckoning is considered. The socio-political echo chamber extended beyond lyricism and performance and was also compounded by the dissemination and marketing of the project. It incorporated the modes of production and consumption, in that the promotional media was gamified, priming users to actively critique the potential and utility of digital environs. The dystopia of Year Zero was both a fiction rendered tangible by digital innovation and a commentary upon effective politics, by consciously interrogating the suitability of gaming ethics to reify a dystopia. Computer games create a mimetic space with a quote, ethical system different from that of the real world, which can represent a commentary, a critique, or a parody of the current ethics in the real world, end quote. The ethical system is separate, however, causing dissonance to willing participants or spectators. Their suspension of disbelief is, in the case of Year Zero, consciously scrutinized from within this parodic system. The freedom to exit this immersive experience is suspended, such that the ideological implications of the real world, post-Patriots Act, are magnified through the spectacle of interactive media. It is not unreasonable to interpret interactive media, computer games and/or virtual reality experiences, as a space of deferred responsibility, designed to either enable an embrace of idealism or a more nefarious fantasy. Mate complicates this by explaining that these interactive environments, from virtual reality through rudimentary video games and expansive concept-driven immersive experiences, also operate by limiting autonomy of identity and agency. He explains that, quote, the user cannot carry over her or his identity, because to become part of the narrative textuality means to be born again in the fictional world and to be confronted with its ethics and politics. It is the suspension of agency, experienced through engagement in a simulacrum of a dystopian United States, which makes this medium of consumption and participation an appropriate one. The Year Zero project, in its communication with fans and consumers, foregrounded issues of autonomy in contrast to authority, and the changing impact of media paradigms. The alternate reality game, I argue, was not merely a marketing gimmick. Its suitability, appeal, and execution are indicative of changing modes of artistic production, marketization, and consumption. Reznor's releases or album cycles from this period onward have all commented in various ways on the ascent of the digital, the redundancy of the physical, and its subsequent potential for subversion. He often highlights a tension between these forms of mass production, making it a leitmotif in his post-Napster output and approach to fan interaction. It is evidenced in a signed mission statement extolling the virtues of vinyl records of the band's web store, and a recent experiment in 2018 involving the sole release of tickets in physical format at venue box offices around the US, negating online ticketing in favor of a more personal experience. Similarly, his 2013 track, Copy of a, voices anxiety about the ubiquity of simulacra, and the utility of art being reduced to mere simulation. His output then can be said to address what Walter Benjamin deemed the condition of art under relentless mechanical or perhaps digital reproduction. Benjamin stated that, quote, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element, its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the time where it happens to be, end quote. This sense of dislocation or willingness to combat ephemerality, however futile, underpins his more recent creative ventures. Year Zero operated on similar principles in that knowledge of its accompanying alternate reality game straddled both the digital and physical spheres, focusing on their nodes of interaction. Digital hegemony was presented as a heavily curated and controlled space, with contextually defunct media demonstrating disruptive potential. The gamification of politically charged promotional activities then offers a critique of changing paradigms of narrative, songcraft, and consumption, contextualized in the case of Year Zero by the psychology of affective politics.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.